Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Reddit series video from the subreddit HFY called Children of the Gun Chapter 5, written by LanScaper. "Are you sure the outer line is going to hold?" Trigg asked. The map was spread out on the ground in front of him. Jimbo peered at the spot where Trigg was pointing. "That's a choke point," Jimbo said. "The hills on either side will funnel them through here. We won't need to cover a lot of area. I suppose that'll have, Trigg was cut short by the creaking, growling sound coming from the woods around them. The Tigelan's ears perked up, and they all stood staring into the forest. A great, crashing sound erupted from the greenery around them, and a stampede of forest animals plunged through the village. Trigg and Jimbo both dove behind the nearest tree and waited for the herd to pass. The sounds of falling trees and splintered lumber grew closer every moment. "Hey, we got incoming. Get up here and tell me what you see. Everyone else, lock and load." Trigg shouted into his radio, and he heard the clamor building behind him. The Tigelans scampered up the tree trunks and into their houses. Trigg watched them as they ran straight up the trees instead of away from the danger. "Damn it!" Trigg yelled. He grabbed Jimbo by the collar and shouted to be heard. "Get as many away as you can. I'll see when I can stall whatever that is." Jimbo nodded and ran off. Trigg pulled his sidearm and eased around the tree he was hiding behind. He kept his body and most of his head concealed, but did look out far enough to see what was happening. 100 meters away or more, Trigg saw great white trees crashing into the ground, but it was disorganized. One tree would crash off from the left, and the other two would crash to the right, then a single tree right of the center, then 3 from the left center. Trigg thought there would have been a single lane being cleared for the invasion, but it appeared to be a haphazard mob making whatever progress they could. Looking closer, Trigg saw figures moving in the trees. With the heavy undergrowth, it was difficult to tell where they were or what they looked like. Trigg stepped back behind the tree and thought for a moment. When he sprinted off to the left, clearing the village boundaries in only a few minutes, he caught a few panicked squeals from high above him as the Tigelans realized what was happening. Trigg circled wide around the approaching enemy. He kept the village more or less in sight as he made his way to the enemy's flank. He kept low and moved as quickly as possible. Several heart-pounding minutes later, Trigg was close enough to see what was pushing down the trees. Each of the creatures stood at least 3 meters tall, with a couple appearing on top of over 4 meters. Their skin was thick gray hide that lightly sparkled in the intermittent light coming through the forest canopy. Their heads were bulbous atop their bodies, with long pointed snouts sticking out front. At the end of the snout was a mass of tentacles that seemed to always be in motion. The black eye spoke some primitive part of Trigg's brain where it set off alarms screaming of predators coming from beyond the firelight to eat him. The creatures' bodies rippled with muscle. Even as Trigg watched, the beasts could strain and push a tree trunk only for it to surrender with a deafening crash a minute later. Trigg saw snapping branches glance off through the hides and elicit no reaction from the creatures. Occasionally, one of the beasts would turn to another, and Trigg could make out the garbled grunting sound. The two would talk for a moment, and then moved on about their business. For all their damage to the forest, they were taking their time. The trees would crash with a mighty thud, and then the creatures would look over at their handiwork and shout to one another in a bragging fashion. There were at least a dozen of the massive monsters working on unleashing the chaos in the forest. Trigg kept his head down, and he hid behind the trees and bushes to stay out of sight. As he was watching the beasts knock over the trees, he heard a low snorting sound from behind him. He wheeled around, bringing his gun up as he turned, and found himself face to chest with one of the enemies. The creature towered over Trigg, blocking the sky from his view. Trigg looked up at the monster's face, well over a meter above his head, its tentacles twitching in the faint forest daylight. Trigg tightened his grip on his gun and started pulling the trigger on a half a heartbeat. In the blink of an eye, Trigg put 3 shots in the center of the monster. The beast looked down at where the energy bolts impacted with a thick grey hide. Trigg followed his gaze and saw 3 smudges where the blasts had splashed harmlessly against the creature. Trigg said, "Crap!" as he raised his weapon and launched another full side, but the monster's tentacles shook violently and Trigg didn't pull the trigger. Trigg found his arms and hands not obeying his orders. He felt his gaze pulled upwards and found himself gazing into the monster's black eyes. As much as Trigg fought, he could not pull his gaze away from the face that enthralled him. Distantly, he felt his arms drop to his sides, and he almost imagined he heard his gun make a quiet whoomp sound as it hit the forest floor. Trigg felt like he was falling into infinity. His body was far beyond, his mind became untethered, becoming weightless and ephemeral. His vision collapsed down as though through a tunnel, and a battlefield in the forest became nothing more than a pinprick of light. Trigg jerked himself awake. He looked around, trying to find the source of his anxiety. He saw he was on a tall hillside, along a narrow path, with half a dozen weary and beaten people following him. He looked down the hill across the long, narrow valley and saw a field of fire. The dark night sky overhead drank up the light from the fires below. Thin orange ribbons crept along the homes and the fields in the valley. Sparks leapt upwards, and Trigg could hear a wild rush of air being pulled into the fires, consuming everything below him. "Why are we stopping?" a voice called from behind Trigg. He turned to see a soot-smeared face reflecting dully in the firelight. "Deacon?" Trigg asked. He felt an unword and uncertain. "But how you? This can't be." "Trigg, we gotta move," Deacon said. "We got hostiles moving in." Trigg looked back down the path and saw the lights on top of the enemy's weapons bouncing along. He looked back at Deacon and shook his head. Trigg said, "Balcor, I'm back in Balcor." End of chapter. Children of the Gun, Chapter 6, written by Altcipher. The small group following Trigg ducked behind him when he slipped into the small cave hidden near the crest of the hill. They were all panting heavily and kept a keen eye on the entrance. "What the hell's going on?" Trigg said. "What are you talking about?" Deacon replied. "The G'tal fleet invaded and we got our rears kicked. Ring a bell?" "What? Yes, I know that, but this was 2 years ago. I'm not here. I'm fighting Lepax and Radara." "Ha ha," Deacon said, moving closer in a tight space. He kept his body between Trigg and the rest of the refugees. "Man, Trigg, you sure do know how to keep the mood light," he said, a bit louder than strictly necessary. He lowered his voice and said, "Are you trying to get us killed? These people trusted you to get them out, and here you are now acting like you've lost your fricking mind. Can you keep your crap together until we get out of this? Because if you can't, the best decision left for me is to toss you back down the path and slow down the G'tal looking for us." Deacon's words came fast and vicious. Trigg looked over Deacon's shoulder at the small family that had followed him out of the valley. A mother, a teenage son, twin daughters, and a toddler in the mother's arms. They swallowed a lump in his throat. "Deacon," Trigg said, trying to keep his voice as quiet as possible, I want you to hit me. Slap me in the face." "You sure you're going with the crazy thing then?" "No, seriously, slap me. Slap the crap out of me," Trigg said. Deacon searched Trigg's eyes for any sign of madness or a joke, but found nothing save honesty. Deacon nodded once and cracked Trigg across the face with a swift backhand. Trigg's head snapped back at the side and left a crack in Deacon's hand against the face echoed through the cave. Trigg held his head to the side for a moment and looked back at Deacon. His eyes were unfocused and jumped from place to place. "Well," Trigg said, "this is odd." "The hell are you talking about?" Deacon said. "I know this is completely crazy, but this is a memory for me. This happened 2 years ago. Balcor was, awful. It was awful. It tore us apart. Our failure here was so brutal that we never really recovered." Trigg said, "You don't think this is real?" Deacon's face was falling with shock and disappointment and fear and 1,000 other emotions, each vying to be the one in control. "No," Trigg said, "or not like you mean. This is a memory. But it's not. When you slapped me, it hurt. The first time I went through Balcor, none of this happened. This conversation never happened, and you never slapped me. So whatever this is, it is something that we don't have a word for. Maybe like a lucid dreaming, but for our memories," Trigg said. Deacon dropped his hands and shook it before he looked back up. "Trig, if you can't handle this, just say so. No one is going to think any less of you. God knows you've done more here than anyone could have expected. Just say the word if you need help. But you don't get to make up crazy stories," he said. "Deacon," Trig said, "I swear to you that everything I just told you is the God's honest truth. I don't know what's happening here, but I think I can prove it." "How?" "Before my first time here, we hid in this cave for a few hours. A patrol found us about half an hour before dawn. 2 GreatGreenGoo scouts, blue checker pattern squad. We never did find out what their company colors meant. If that happens, then we know I'm not just losing my mind." Deacon thought for a moment and then turned to the family they were escorting. "Get some sleep, if you can," he said. "We rest here for a while." He turned back to Trig and loud enough for everyone else to hear, "At least until morning." They slept in shifts, with Trig watching first, Deacon wanting to be sure that if Trig's prediction came true, that nothing Trig had done caused it to happen. The sky was just beginning to lighten as Deacon sat near the edge of the cave. He dared not stick out his head any further for fear of alerting the enemy to their hideout. Trig and the refugee family slept behind him, deeper in the cave. Deacon calmed his breathing to listen for any sounds of an approaching enemy. As he counting the snores of people behind him, Deacon heard the soft footfalls of a pair of people making their way along the hillside path. He tightened his grip on his rifle and leaned forward to see if he could locate them before they got too close. Deacon could just make out the movements in the pre-dawn light, but could not distinguish anything more than a rough guess of the size, with no hope of telling a human from a GreatGreenGoo. Deacon watched the shapes move closer for a bit, and estimated that he would have several minutes if they picked their way around the gently weaving path, and made sure that they would not make too much noise. He slipped back in the cave as quickly as he could, without making any undue racket. He placed his hand over Trig's mouth and shook him awake. Trig's eyes snapped open almost immediately, and his hand was at his gun instantly. Trig could make out Deacon leaning over him and saw Deacon hold his finger to his lips. Deacon slipped his hand away from Trig's mouth and jerked his head towards the cave entrance. Trig nodded, and Deacon stepped back. Trig rolled over and crawled to the mouth of the cave and joined Deacon. Deacon pointed down the slope, and Trig could make out the two shapes moving closer with each passing moment. Trig looked at Deacon, and his face seemed to say, "I told you so." Deacon nodded his head, but then pointed back to the shapes coming up the hill. Trig nodded. Both men crouched down and brought their rifles to bear. Trig held up a hand, motioning for Deacon to hold his fire. Trig then signaled and let the enemy get closer, and then Trig would take the one on the left, and Deacon would take the one on their right. Deacon nodded his understanding. As the two fighters came closer and the sky became lighter, Trig and Deacon could both make out the crested uniforms of the GreatGreenGoo. The scouts were just as Trig had prophesied. Trig was both excited and concerned that he was right, but even more concerned was that this was not how this happened the first time around. The GreatGreenGoo were making good progress up the path. Trig and Deacon kept their respective targets in their sights the whole time. When the enemy was no more than a dozen steps away, Trig signaled for Deacon to be ready to fire. Deacon tightened his grip on his rifle and watched for Trig's shot out of the corner of his eye. As the GreatGreenGoo rounded the last minor curve, putting them no more than 5 or 6 steps away from where they would start to notice the cave opening, Trig opened fire. Half a heartbeat later, Deacon's shot erupted from the front of his rifle as well. Each man only fired once, and each man claimed one dead GreatGreenGoo. The noise woke up the civilians behind them, but they kept their eyes open for any more GreatGreenGoo coming up the path. After a few minutes, no more enemies approached, and Trig turned to face the civilians. "Get up and get ready to move," he said. The mother was awake and nodded. She began waking her brood and getting them ready to travel. "What the hell was that?" Deacon asked as the civilians were walking. "How the hell did you know the 2 scouts?" He kept his voice low in case any other enemies happened by and out of habit. "The first time I was here," Trig said, "they caught us still half asleep. I was the guard for early morning shift that time. I think I'd half dozed off and they got too close. They winged me, but they killed you. The oldest kid grabbed up my rifle and then put a shot right through the middle of him, too. I finally managed to get them both down. By then, they had already radioed in our position. I was wounded and escorting a mother and her kids. I was the only one to make it to the LZ. Jesus, Deacon said. So you're telling me that you've been here before, and this crappy cave is where I bought the farm? More or less, Trigg said. I thought this was just a memory, that these jerk aliens I'm fighting were making me relive my worst memory of my life. But in my memory, you're dead. I'm still not convinced this is real, and I'm not hallucinating, but at least I know it's not on rails. You mean the Ch.5+6? What? The arsehole aliens. You mean the Ch.5+6? No, Trigg said. The Lepax, the Ch.5+6 are in my past. I've already fought them here on Balcor. The Lepax are in my present. I'm fighting them on Radara. Are you sure you didn't maybe hit your head on every rock on this planet? Maybe you just like a ton of closed head trauma and spontaneously come down with a terminal case of batshit crazy. Yeah, it does sound a bit insane, Trigg said. Believe me, I know. I'm telling you the truth as best I know it. I've also never hallucinated before, so I don't know what it feels like. But this feels real to me as anything I've ever known. End of chapter. And that, my friends, concludes this dose of science fiction fun. I hope that you enjoyed. And if you did, please don't forget to support the author from the link down below. But if you want to support this channel, there are links as well down below for you to help with. But the easiest way would be to share this video. And if you are so inclined, subscribe as well. I will see you all in the next episode, and I hope that you all have a fantastic time until then. Cheers.